I was 76 years old when my daughter announced that she was finally going to marry. For many fathers, that kind of news brings unambiguous joy, the promise of continuation, of belonging to a family circle that might feel tighter and warmer than ever. But for me, the announcement carried a weight of contradiction, because although I wanted desperately to share in her happiness, the years that had passed since my wife's death had been filled with a slow erosion of trust and closeness between me and my only child. My name is Harold Whitmore. I spent more than 4 decades of my life as a mechanic in a small town in Iowa, a town that never made it onto anyone's tourist maps, but where I knew every intersection and every person who ever drove a car that needed fixing. I was proud of my trade, not because it was glamorous, but because it was honest, and because it gave me the ability to provide a roof and a decent education for my daughter Margaret, whom I had always simply called Maggie. After my wife Eleanor passed away suddenly from a heart attack 15 years ago, my world contracted, and Maggie remained the only immediate family I had. Yet rather than drawing closer, we seemed to drift apart, as if grief had left each of us on different islands with no bridge between. In those early years after Eleanor's death, I tried my best to fill both parental roles. I cooked clumsily. I made sure Maggie finished college, and when she told me she wanted to go into business management, I took money out of the savings account that Eleanor and I had guarded for decades so she would not have to begin her adult life burdened with debt. I thought those sacrifices would strengthen the bond between us. But as time went by, the gratitude faded into something harder, a coolness that I could never quite thaw. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent, and although we lived no more than a 2-hour drive apart, the distance between us felt immeasurable. I often sat in my living room, surrounded by Eleanor's photographs and Maggie's childhood drawings, remembering how that little girl once jumped into my lap when I came home, smelling of engine grease, telling me I was her hero, her strong daddy who could fix anything in the world. Those memories were like warm embers I kept blowing on, hoping they would reignite into a fire of real closeness again. But the years only deepened the ash. So when Maggie called one gray November morning and said she was engaged, my heart clenched with conflicting feelings. She did not ask if I approved. She did not introduce the man to me beforehand. She merely informed me of the decision, as though I were an afterthought, a formality to be ticked off on a list. The man's name, she said, was Colin. He was from a family in Chicago, worked in real estate, ambitious, polished, and in her words, someone who understood her ambitions in ways I never could. I should have been happy that she found someone to share her life with. But the tone in her voice made me feel like an antique she had stored away in the attic, something she needed to mention once before forgetting again. Still, I told her I was proud of her and that I would be there for the wedding, even though I could hear in her hesitant silence that my presence was not something she longed for, but something she tolerated. In the weeks that followed, I began to prepare myself for the event. I was not a man of fashion. My wardrobe consisted mostly of work shirts and old jackets. But I had one pair of black leather shoes that Eleanor had insisted I buy when we married. They had been resoled 3 times, polished countless times, and though the leather was cracked in places, they carried with them the memory of that day when Eleanor walked down the aisle toward me, her eyes filled with light and trust. I had worn them on every important occasion of my life. Maggie's baptism, her school graduations, Eleanor's funeral, even my own retirement party organized by neighbors. Those shoes were not just shoes, they were a map of my life's milestones, carrying the weight of everything that had defined me as a husband, a father, and eventually a widower. When I decided I would wear them at Maggie's wedding, it was not out of stubbornness or poverty. It was because it felt like Eleanor herself would walk beside me through those shoes, reminding Maggie of the family roots that had nourished her. As the day approached, I noticed subtle signs that my involvement was considered more of an inconvenience than a joy. Maggie never once asked me about the guest list, about who I might want to invite, even though I had friends who had known her since she was a toddler. The invitations were handled by her future in-laws, who sent me a card with instructions more than an invitation. The suit rental was arranged without consulting me, and when I timidly asked if I might bring my own suit, the one I had carefully preserved since Eleanor's funeral, Maggie brushed it off with a laugh, saying it would look too dated among Colin's family. I accepted all these small humiliations in silence, telling myself that weddings were stressful and that daughters often grew impatient under pressure. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that I was not truly wanted, that my role was more ceremonial than familial, as though I were a relic dragged into the spotlight for one last performance before being tucked away again. On the morning of the wedding, I woke earlier than usual. My small house felt colder than ever, and I brewed myself a cup of coffee while looking at Eleanor's photograph on the mantel. I told her quietly, almost like a prayer, that I would do my best to honor the day, to behave with dignity even if I felt out of place. Then I opened the box where I had kept the black leather shoes, polished them until they shone as much as their age allowed, and placed them beside my chair, ready to slip them on once I was dressed. There was a heaviness in my chest that I could not shake, but I told myself it was only nerves, the natural sadness of a father giving away his daughter. As I looked around my modest living room, filled with memories and silence, I thought perhaps this wedding could be a turning point, a chance to mend the fractured bond between us, to remind Maggie that despite all differences, I was still her father, still the man who had carried her on his shoulders when she was small, still the man who had worked nights to make sure her college tuition was paid on time. I clung to that hope as if it were a lifeline, unaware of the humiliation that awaited me. By the time I arrived at the church, dressed in my best suit and holding carefully onto those shoes, the air was thick with chatter and the bustle of guests who barely noticed me. Colin's family greeted each other with easy familiarity, expensive fabrics rustling, laughter echoing, while I stood at the edge like an intruder at his own daughter's celebration. I searched for Maggie in the crowd, hoping for a warm smile, a sign that she was glad I had come. But when she finally turned and saw me, her expression was polite, restrained, the kind of smile one offers to a distant relative rather than to a father. She kissed me on the cheek, perfunctorily, and whispered that I should hurry to change and be ready for photographs. That was all. No warmth, no tenderness, just efficiency. I swallowed my disappointment and headed toward the small room they had prepared for me, holding onto those shoes as if they were my last defense against disappearing altogether. In that quiet room, as I placed the shoes carefully on the floor and sat down to lace them, I could not help but feel Eleanor's absence, like a physical weight. She would have known how to break the ice, how to comfort me, how to bridge the distance between Maggie and me with a simple touch or word. Without her, I felt clumsy, unwanted, and terribly vulnerable. Yet I reminded myself again that this was Maggie's day, that whatever pain I felt must be set aside for her happiness. With that thought, I began to prepare, unaware that even the simple act of putting on those shoes would soon be denied to me, and that what was meant to be a symbol of love and memory would be twisted into an instrument of humiliation. When I returned from the small preparation room to the main hall, expecting to take my place quietly among the early arriving guests, I realized almost immediately that something was wrong, though at first I could not define it. I glanced down at the polished leather shoes that had carried me through decades of my life, only to discover that they were no longer by the chair where I had placed them with such care. At first I thought perhaps in my nervousness I had moved them absent-mindedly, maybe tucked them under the table or pushed them against the wall, but after searching every corner of the room, lifting garments and peering behind the chair, I knew they had vanished. My chest tightened with a strange mixture of panic and disbelief, for those shoes were not simply footwear, but the last tangible link between me and Eleanor, a sacred relic of our shared history, and the thought that they might have been misplaced, or worse, deliberately taken, filled me with an unease I could not suppress. I opened the door into the hallway and saw two of the bridesmaids giggling with their smartphones, whispering as they glanced at me, and I had the sudden suspicion that my misfortune was the subject of some hidden joke. I asked if they had seen a pair of black shoes, carefully polished, left in the small room, but they only shrugged and offered vague smiles, saying perhaps someone had tidied them away. The tone in their voices carried the unmistakable lilt of mockery, and when they turned back to each other with muffled laughter, I felt the blood rise in my face. It was not simply that the shoes were gone. It was the way these young women, whom I barely knew, treated my panic as amusement, as if the discomfort of an old man were a spectacle. I made my way toward Maggie, who was standing near the altar with Colin and his parents, absorbed in last-minute details. I waited until she noticed me, then leaned in and whispered that my shoes had disappeared and asked if she knew anything about it. Her expression shifted for a brief instant, a flicker of guilt or irritation before settling into a cold kind of composure. She told me in a clipped voice that it was probably nothing, that perhaps someone had moved them by mistake, and that I should not make a scene on her wedding day. I tried to explain how important those shoes were to me, that they were the shoes I had married her mother in, that I had worn them at every milestone of her life, but she cut me off with a sharp whisper that I should not embarrass her in front of her new family by clinging to relics of the past. The words pierced me more deeply than she could have imagined, because in that moment I realized she saw not a father trying to honor his wife's memory, but a burden, a shabby old man clinging to sentimental junk. Colin, overhearing our exchange, smirked and told me perhaps it was a sign that I should upgrade for the occasion, and that he had instructed someone to fetch a pair of new shoes from a nearby store that would fit the dignity of the event. His voice was oily with false courtesy, and I understood at once that this was no accident. They had hidden my shoes, not misplaced them. It was a deliberate act, dressed up as a playful joke, intended to strip me of my symbol of pride and force me into something more palatable to them, more in keeping with the polished image of the Whitmore Hastings wedding that would be displayed on social media and remembered by their circle of wealthy friends. I wanted to shout, to demand my shoes back, to accuse them of cruelty. But when I looked at Maggie's face, I saw only a hardness, as if she had already chosen her side, and it was not mine. The ceremony began with me sitting stiffly in the second row, my feet trapped in a pair of stiff rental shoes that pinched with every step, while Eleanor's shoes, the ones I had longed to wear, were hidden somewhere as if they were shameful. I watched my daughter walk down the aisle, radiant in her dress, but when she passed by me, she did not meet my eyes, and I understood that I had been pushed into the shadows of her life, an unwelcome reminder of where she came from. The guests smiled, whispered, and clapped, but I could feel some of them stealing glances at me, at my ill-fitting shoes, at the way I shifted uncomfortably, and in their eyes I could read the silent judgment. Here was the poor widowed father, tolerated but not honored, the old man who could not even keep hold of his own shoes. During the reception that followed, the humiliation deepened. I overheard fragments of conversations, Colin's relatives chuckling that the old man nearly lost his mind over a pair of shabby shoes, and Maggie herself laughing along, explaining to them that I was overly sentimental, that I got confused easily, that they had to manage me carefully these days. Each word felt like a lash across my back, for she was not merely dismissing me, but constructing a narrative in which I was already half senile, a doddering figure to be patronized and controlled. It was in that moment, as I sat isolated at my assigned table while others danced and toasted, that I realized the disappearance of my shoes was not just a prank. It was a symbol of a larger plan, a rehearsal for stripping me of more than leather and laces. It was the first act in erasing my dignity, my independence, and ultimately my claim to the life I had built. Later in the evening, when I retreated briefly into the coat room to collect myself, I overheard a conversation that confirmed my fears. Maggie was speaking in low tones to Colin, but the walls were thin and their words carried. She said she was glad the shoes had been hidden because it proved how much of a child I had become, clinging to the past, incapable of adjusting. Colin replied that it worked perfectly for their plan, that once the marriage was formalized, they would move quickly to handle the house, that the documents I had signed years earlier, under the impression they were routine banking forms, gave them more authority than I realized. He said the sooner I was placed in assisted living, the better, that it would save them trouble and embarrassment. Maggie murmured agreement, saying it was the only practical solution, that she could not be saddled with a father who made scenes and obsessed over old shoes while she was trying to climb socially with Colin's family. I stood frozen, barely breathing, as the reality sank in. My own daughter, the child I had carried on my shoulders, was conspiring to push me out of my home, to confine me to some sterile facility, and to justify it all by portraying me as an unstable old man, obsessed with relics. The shoes were never the issue. They were a convenient prop in a cruel theater designed to humiliate me in public, and to establish the story that I was unfit to manage my own affairs. That realization hit me harder than any physical blow could have, and as I leaned against the wall of that coat room, my knees trembling, I knew with absolute clarity that something irrevocable had shifted. I was no longer merely the father of the bride. I had become the obstacle in their way, the last barrier between them and the life they envisioned, a life built on the foundation of my erasure. When I returned to the reception hall, the music was loud and the laughter deafening, but inside me there was only silence, a heavy and devastating silence. I took my seat again, smiling weakly at those who passed, but in my heart I was already somewhere else, trying to comprehend how love could twist so completely into betrayal. The shoes were gone, but the loss was greater than leather. It was the loss of my daughter's loyalty, the shattering of the illusion that she still saw me as her father rather than as a burden to be managed and eventually discarded. That was the true catalyst, the moment when I realized that the life I thought I still owned, the house, the dignity, the family, was already slipping into their hands unless I found a way to reclaim it. The rest of that evening unfolded with a slow, suffocating inevitability, each moment another reminder that I no longer belonged, that I was not a cherished father witnessing his daughter's new life, but a tolerated relic, a piece of background, furniture to be pushed out of sight whenever he threatened to disturb the carefully arranged stage. As the music swelled and the newlyweds took to the dance floor for their first dance, I remained at my table, trying to blend into the dim corner, forcing myself to applaud with the others, though my hands felt heavy as stone. Guests passed by me with polite nods, some offering shallow smiles that carried a faint undertone of pity, as though they recognized my displacement, but did not dare to acknowledge it aloud. I could not escape the growing awareness that I was the subject of whispers, that the story of the missing shoes was spreading like a joke among the guests, each retelling making me smaller, weaker, more ridiculous, until in their eyes I was no longer Harold Whitmore, a man who had raised a daughter alone after his wife's death, but only the old man who lost his shoes at the wedding. When the photographer came to gather family members for a series of posed portraits, I rose with hesitant eagerness, thinking at last here was a moment where my presence mattered, where I would be framed in the pictures that would one day be shown to grandchildren, perhaps proof that I had not been entirely erased. Yet when I approached, Maggie intercepted me with a practiced smile, whispering through her teeth that perhaps it would be better if I sat this one out, that Colin's family had arranged a specific vision for the photos, and it might look awkward if I appeared out of step, dressed in my old suit with rental shoes. I stared at her in disbelief, unable to comprehend that she was seriously suggesting her own father should be absent from the official record of her wedding. But before I could protest, Colin himself placed a hand on my shoulder with the kind of feigned gentleness one uses on a confused child, telling me not to worry, that they would take plenty of pictures together later, after the formalities, and that for now I should relax and enjoy myself. His tone was soothing but final, and I realized there would be no pictures of me beside my daughter in her wedding album, no visible proof that I had even been there. I returned to my table in a haze, my appetite gone, my glass of champagne untouched, and for the first time in my life, I felt the sting of true invisibility, the sense that I had been deliberately erased from my own bloodline's narrative. As I sat there watching the festivities, my humiliation was deepened by the realization that several guests were openly laughing at my expense, recounting the story of my frantic search for the shoes, mimicking the way I had bent to look under. Tables, shaking their heads as if to say, "Poor man, he's not all there anymore." Maggie passed by once, and instead of meeting my gaze with compassion or even discomfort, she avoided my eyes entirely, her laughter blending with theirs, as if she had decided to stand firmly with them against me. That was the moment when the humiliation shifted from private pain to something sharper, because I realized it was no longer about me alone, but about how she wanted others to see me. As a weak old man to be dismissed, pitied, and controlled. I tried to leave early, but when I rose to gather my coat, one of Colin's relatives intercepted me, telling me that the bride and groom had prepared a small, special moment for me later in the evening, and that it would be unkind if I left before it happened. The phrasing struck me as odd, but I returned to my chair, convincing myself that perhaps Maggie had remembered me after all, that perhaps there was still a place for me in her heart, and that she intended some kind of acknowledgement. Yet when the time came, the DJ announced a playful tribute to the bride's father, and to my horror, a slideshow appeared on the screen, filled not with warm family memories, but with a series of pictures chosen to highlight my supposed oddities, grainy shots of me sleeping in my chair with my mouth open, a photo of me in a hospital gown after a minor surgery, an image of me years ago with grease-stained hands wiping sweat from my brow in the garage. The guests roared with laughter, Maggie clapping along, while I sat paralyzed, realizing that my dignity had been turned into entertainment. It was crueler than any insult, because it had been presented as affection, packaged as comedy, yet beneath it lay the clear intention of reducing me to caricature, of solidifying in the eyes of everyone present that I was no longer to be respected as a man, but pitied or mocked as a doddering fool. I excused myself, muttering something about fresh air, and stumbled outside into the cold night, the muffled sound of laughter still spilling through the church hall doors. I leaned against the stone wall, breathing hard, and asked myself how my own daughter could have allowed such a thing. The answer came unbidden and brutal. She no longer thought of me as her father, not in the way Eleanor had always been my partner, my equal, my support. To her I was a liability, a problem to be managed, a story to be shaped for others' amusement. When I finally returned home that night, long after the music had faded and the hall had emptied, I sat in my armchair staring at the empty space where my wife's photograph rested. I spoke aloud to Eleanor, asking her if she could see what had happened, if she could understand how her daughter had treated me, and though I received no reply, I felt an emptiness settle into me deeper than grief, the emptiness of betrayal by the one person left in the world who was supposed to honor me. My humiliation at the wedding had not been an isolated incident. It was a warning, a signal of what lay ahead. If Maggie could laugh at me in front of strangers, if she could erase me from the family photographs and turn my life into a punchline, then she could just as easily erase me from my home, from my finances, from the very fabric of her life. The first escalation had already taken place, not in the theft of my shoes, but in the theft of my place as a father. And I knew the battles to come would not be fought with jokes and photographs, but with papers and signatures, and the stakes would be my very existence. The days that followed the wedding stretched out in a fog of silence. Yet within that silence, I could hear echoes of the laughter, the whispers, the smirks that had surrounded me on the day I should have been honored. I tried to convince myself that perhaps I was overreacting, that weddings were hectic, and Maggie had been swept away by the tide of obligations, that her coldness was not intentional, but circumstantial, that she might call me in a week or two, apologize in her careful way, and restore at least a fraction of the closeness we once shared. But that call never came. Instead, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, delivered not by Maggie herself, but by a courier, and inside I found documents I did not immediately understand, notices of changes to property records, requests for my signature on papers that seemed to reassign responsibilities connected to my house, assurances that it was for simplification and future planning. My first instinct was confusion, followed by a slow-burning suspicion, because I remembered clearly the words I had overheard on the wedding night when Colin and Maggie had whispered about assisted living and control. I took the documents to a neighbor, a retired schoolteacher who still had a sharp eye for detail, and she confirmed what my gut already feared. Hidden among the legal jargon were clauses that would effectively transfer decision-making power over my property to my daughter and her new husband, giving them authority to sell or mortgage the house without my consent. My hands trembled as I held those papers, not only because of the betrayal they represented, but because of the calculated timing. They had chosen to send them so soon after the wedding, hoping that the haze of sentimentality and exhaustion would dull my judgment, that I would sign without reading, that I would surrender my home with the same blind trust with which I had once surrendered my savings for Maggie's education. The realization was like ice water poured over me. The humiliation at the wedding had not been a random cruelty. It had been the opening act of a campaign to strip me of everything that tied me to independence. That night, I could not sleep. I wandered through the small rooms of my house, touching the walls Eleanor had painted, the curtains she had chosen, the photographs she had hung, and I felt as though ghosts were whispering to me, urging me to stand firm, to resist, to remember that this house was more than wood and plaster. It was the place where Maggie had taken her first steps, where Eleanor and I had celebrated anniversaries, where neighbors had gathered for birthdays and Christmases. To sign those papers would not be an administrative step. It would be an act of erasure, an agreement to let myself be pushed into a corner until I disappeared altogether. For the first time in my life, I felt a deep, almost primal fear of losing not just a home, but an identity. And I realized that if I yielded now, there would be no stopping what came next. A week later, the fear was confirmed when Maggie finally called. Her voice was polite but distant, as if she were speaking to a client rather than a father, and she told me it was important for me to sign the documents promptly because Colin had plans that depended on the property being freed of complications. When I asked her if those plans involved selling my house, she hesitated too long before answering, and the hesitation told me more than any denial could. She then shifted her tone, softening into the kind of false gentleness I had heard at the wedding, saying that she worried about me being alone, that the house was too large, too full of memories, too much for an old man to manage, and that an assisted living community would give me companionship and safety. I wanted to believe those words, but I remembered too clearly the disdain in her voice when she had laughed at my missing shoes, the cold efficiency with which she had excluded me from her photographs, and I knew that what she called safety was in truth exile. After I hung up the phone, my decision was made. I would not sign. More than that, I would find out exactly what rights I still possessed, what protections remained. It was in that moment, pacing the living room, with the worn carpet beneath my feet, that I experienced the true midpoint of this ordeal. The shift from passive humiliation to active resistance. The wedding had been their theater of mockery. The documents were their legal maneuver. But I would not be their victim any longer. I gathered every paper I had kept over the years, from the mortgage Eleanor and I had once proudly paid off to the insurance policies, the bank accounts, the old wills, and I spread them across the table like weapons in a battle yet to be fought. For the first time in months, perhaps in years, I felt a spark of clarity. They might have taken my dignity in front of their guests, but they would not take the roof over my head, not while I still drew breath. That night I opened the closet and saw the space where my wedding shoes should have been. They were still gone, perhaps thrown away by someone who thought they were only relics, perhaps hidden in some box in Colin's car to be laughed at later. Their absence burned in me, but it also steeled me, because I realized they had underestimated me. They thought by stripping me of symbols they had stripped me of strength, but what they had done instead was reveal their true intentions, and in that revelation lay my resolve. The midpoint was not a single moment, but a turning tide, the point at which humiliation transformed into determination, and I understood then that the battle ahead would define not only the rest of my life, but the legacy of who I was as a man. In the weeks that followed my refusal to sign those documents, the atmosphere around me began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways, as though an invisible net was tightening with each passing day, a net woven not of ropes and knots, but of whispered insinuations, bureaucratic maneuvers, and the quiet cruelty of a daughter who no longer saw her father as a man, but as an obstacle. At first it came in the form of phone calls, Maggie's voice shifting between irritation and feigned compassion, telling me she understood that I was confused, that it was natural for someone my age to resist change, that sooner or later I would realize that the sensible course of action was to let go of the house and embrace the comfort of a community where, as she put it, I would not be alone with my memories. Each time she spoke those words, I felt the sting of betrayal more keenly, because what she dismissed as memories were the very threads of my existence. The voice of Eleanor in the kitchen, the laughter of Maggie herself as a child, the warmth of countless ordinary evenings that had given my life meaning. To surrender those memories would be to surrender myself, and I told her firmly I would not. But Maggie was not a child anymore, and she was not acting alone. Colin, with his real estate ambition and his calculating mind, had already anticipated my resistance, and soon his influence became apparent in ways that unsettled me deeply. Letters began arriving from banks I had never dealt with, inquiring about refinancing options, suggesting that my property was being considered for potential sale. I visited the bank in person, confused, and the clerk informed me with polite detachment that my daughter and her husband had approached them with preliminary inquiries, citing their authority under the very documents they had tried to trick me into signing. When I explained that I had not granted such authority, the clerk merely shrugged, telling me that families often misunderstood each other, that these matters could be sorted out legally. And for the first time, I understood how dangerous paperwork could be when twisted by those with sharp eyes for loopholes. It was then that I remembered the conversation I had overheard at the wedding, the whisper of Colin saying that the documents I had already signed years ago gave them more power than I realized. I ransacked my filing cabinet until I found the stack of forms Maggie had once persuaded me to sign under the pretense of making banking easier, documents she had thrust before me when she was still in college, when I trusted her without hesitation, when Eleanor had already passed, and my loneliness had made me vulnerable to the illusion that obedience was love. I spread them across the table and tried to decipher the legal language, my eyes blurring with fatigue, my heart pounding as I began to see the contours of their strategy. Buried in those forms was a power of attorney clause, one that could be interpreted, if pushed, as granting her authority to act on my behalf in financial matters. But there was a mistake, a detail that gave me a lifeline. The notary had failed to complete a section, leaving the clause incomplete, technically unenforceable. That omission, which must have seemed trivial at the time, was now my salvation, though I knew it would not stop Maggie and Colin from trying to exploit the confusion it created. Around this time, the phone calls shifted tone. No longer was Maggie speaking of concern and companionship. Instead, she began to hint at incidents that had never occurred, weaving a narrative designed to paint me as incompetent. She told me she had heard from a neighbor that I often left the stove on, that smoke had been seen rising from my kitchen. I knew with certainty that this was false, because I had become meticulous to the point of paranoia about checking the stove after Eleanor's death. Yet her words unsettled me, for I realized she was not speaking to me alone. She was rehearsing a story that she intended to tell others, a story in which I was already halfway senile. Later, she accused me of forgetting to pay bills, though my records were clear. And when I protested, she sighed as though humoring a child, telling me again that denial was common in cases like mine. Cases like mine, those words echoed in my ears, for they revealed her intention more clearly than any slip of paper. She was preparing to declare me unfit to take not only my property, but my autonomy, and she intended to use the law as her weapon. The cruelty of this realization was not in the strategy itself, but in the coldness with which it was pursued. I was not a stranger to Maggie. I was her father, the man who had carried her through fevers, who had sold his own tools to pay for her textbooks, who had walked miles to pick up antibiotics when she was a child. Yet now she weaponized my age, turning the slow decline of memory that visits every old man into an accusation, twisting the natural forgetfulness of 76 years into evidence of incapacity. I began to see the escalation in every detail. The way Colin spoke to me with exaggerated slowness, as though addressing someone already drifting into dementia. The way Maggie corrected me in conversations, even when I was not mistaken, planting seeds of doubt in the ears of anyone who listened. The way invitations to family gatherings ceased altogether, replaced by sterile texts about safety and responsibility. But the worst blow came one afternoon when I received an unexpected visit from a social worker. She arrived at my door with a clipboard and a polite smile, telling me she had been contacted with concerns about my well-being, that there had been reports of neglect, of potential hazards in my home. I invited her inside, embarrassed but determined to show her the truth. She inspected the kitchen, the living room, the neat stacks of bills paid on time, and though she found nothing alarming, she gently advised me to consider assisted living, as though planting another seed. When I asked who had contacted her, she would not say, but I did not need confirmation. I could hear Maggie's voice behind every word, could feel Colin's hand guiding every maneuver. It was no longer a private family conflict. It was an escalation into the public sphere, a campaign to create a record, a file that could one day be used against me in court. That night I sat at my table staring at the documents, the memories, the echoes of laughter from the wedding, and I realized with a clarity that chilled me, my daughter had become my adversary. The child I had once rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I had kissed, now sought to strip me of everything that made me a man, reducing me to a ward under her control. The humiliation of the shoes, the erasure from photographs, the slideshow of mockery, those had been signals, warnings of what was to come. But this was the escalation, the transformation of mockery into strategy, the revelation of motives I had not wanted to believe. Maggie and Colin did not merely want me out of the way, they wanted everything I had built, and they were willing to break me to get it. And so I resolved, in that long night of fear and trembling hands, that I would not be broken. If they wished to escalate, so would I. I would find a lawyer. I would use every flaw in those documents. I would expose their lies, and above all, I would cling to the truth of who I was. I was not the senile caricature they presented. I was Harold Whitmore, husband of Eleanor, father of Maggie, mechanic of 4 decades, homeowner, taxpayer, neighbor, man. And though they had hidden my shoes, though they had tried to leave me barefoot in the eyes of the world, I would walk forward with or without them, and I would not surrender until the last breath left my body. The moment of decision came not with a sudden flash of drama, but with a quiet, almost bureaucratic inevitability. The kind of letter that slides through a mail slot and looks unassuming until its words detonate like explosives inside your chest. It was a notice, formally worded, informing me that a petition had been filed to review my capacity to manage my own affairs, a legal request initiated by my daughter and her husband, claiming that I was no longer of sound mind and that guardianship should be granted to them for my protection. I read the letter 3 times in disbelief, then once more aloud as though hearing the words might make them less real. But each repetition only deepened the sting. Maggie had crossed the threshold from hints and manipulations into outright war, declaring in public record what she had been whispering in private, that her father was unfit to live as a free man. For a long time, I sat at the table, unable to move, staring at the page, while Eleanor's photograph seemed to watch me with patient sorrow, and I whispered to her that I would not let them erase me, that even in the loneliness of old age I would stand upright for the life we had built together. The days that followed were a blur of frantic preparation, meetings with a lawyer who listened with steady patience as I poured out every detail, from the shoes hidden on the wedding day to the social worker's visit to the carefully planted stories of confusion and neglect. He studied the documents I had found in my files, nodded at the notary's omission, and told me that what Colin and Maggie sought would not hold if we fought with evidence, that the law still recognized clarity when it was presented plainly, but he warned me that their strategy would not be easily defeated. They would bring witnesses, perhaps neighbors, misled by rumors, perhaps even doctors persuaded to give ambiguous statements about age and memory. And in such matters, perception could weigh as heavily as fact. I left his office that day carrying both dread and resolve, knowing the climax had arrived, knowing that I would soon stand in a courtroom, not as a father, but as a defendant in the story my daughter had written about me. When the hearing day arrived, I wore the same suit I had worn at the wedding, though the shoes on my feet were not the beloved pair Eleanor had given me, but another pair I had purchased, plain and serviceable. I walked into the courthouse feeling as though the floor itself might give way beneath me, yet I forced myself to meet the eyes of those present, to remember that I was not a ghost, but a man still living, still breathing, still capable. Maggie sat at the opposite table beside Colin, her expression carefully composed, her posture elegant, as if she were the dutiful daughter reluctantly fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. She would not look at me, but I could see in the way her lips tightened that she had rehearsed this performance, that she was prepared to paint me as a danger to myself, as a man too frail to trust with his own life. The judge listened as their lawyer spoke first, spinning a narrative so polished it made my stomach churn. He described me as isolated, forgetful, prone to confusion, a man who had lost track of his belongings during his daughter's wedding, who had been found wandering in distress, who had frightened relatives with his volatility. Each word twisted reality until I scarcely recognized myself in the portrait he painted. And when I glanced around the room, I saw a few people nodding as though the story rang true. Then Maggie was called to speak, and she did so with a voice that trembled artfully, her eyes glistening as she told the court how much she loved me, how deeply she worried about me, how difficult it was to watch her father deteriorate, how the missing shoes at her wedding had been a heartbreaking sign that I no longer had control of my memory. She spoke of bills unpaid, of medications forgotten, of nights when she feared I might leave the stove burning. And though each detail was false, she delivered them with such sincerity that for a moment I wondered if she herself had begun to believe. The lies. Then it was my turn. My lawyer guided me to the stand, and as I sat there, the room spinning with the weight of all those eyes, I felt Eleanor's presence like a steadying hand on my shoulder. I spoke slowly, not in anger, but with the clarity that had been my only weapon, recounting the truth of what had happened, the deliberate hiding of the shoes, the laughter at my expense, the attempt to trick me into signing away my home, the visit from the social worker prompted by false reports. I described the documents, the notary's error, the careful payments I had made without fail, the meticulous routines I had maintained for years. I spoke not as a lawyer, but as a man, a husband, a father who had loved and given and who now stood betrayed. And as the words poured out, I felt a strength return to me, not the strength of youth, but the strength of truth. When the medical examiner appointed by the court presented his report, confirming that I was fully competent, that my memory was intact, that my judgment was sound, a ripple moved through the room. Maggie's face hardened, Colin's jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw not confidence, but panic flicker in their eyes. The judge asked me directly if I wished to maintain control of my affairs, and I answered firmly that I did, that while age had bent my back, it had not broken my mind, that while grief had hollowed parts of me, it had not stolen my capacity to live as a man. The judge nodded, made notes, and when he delivered his ruling that the petition for guardianship was denied and that the attempted misuse of documents would be investigated, I felt a wave of release so profound it was as though a chain had snapped from my chest. I did not gloat. I did not look at Maggie with triumph, because triumph was not what I felt. What I felt was sorrow deeper than any courtroom could contain, the sorrow of a father who had stood across from his daughter in battle and won, but in winning had lost something that could never be restored. The climax had come not in the legal victory alone, but in the revelation that the bond between us was broken beyond repair, that the little girl who once held my hand no longer existed, replaced by a woman who saw me only as an obstacle to her ambitions. I walked out of that courthouse with my head high, but my heart was heavy, carrying both the dignity I had reclaimed and the unbearable knowledge that I had had to fight my own blood to keep it. When the courtroom battle was over and the papers had been filed, when the legal haze that had hung over my house finally lifted, I returned to my quiet rooms with a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion, the kind of heaviness that comes not only from the struggle itself, but from the realization of what the struggle had cost. I still had my home, I still had my autonomy, and the law had affirmed that my mind was sound. Yet the victory tasted bitter, because it had been won against my own daughter, the only child Eleanor and I had brought into this world. In the weeks that followed, I received no calls, no visits, not even a short note from Maggie, and though part of me longed for reconciliation, another part understood that the silence was final, that whatever thread still connected us had been cut cleanly in that courtroom when she chose to stand before strangers and declare me unfit to live as myself. The neighbors congratulated me quietly, shaking my hand with respect, telling me I had been brave, but their kindness only highlighted the absence of the one voice I most wanted to hear. I sat often in the evenings with Eleanor's photograph, speaking aloud to her as though she were still in the room, telling her how the case had unfolded, how the judge had seen through the lies, how justice had been done. Yet each time I told the story, my voice faltered when I reached the part about Maggie, because no matter how righteous the outcome, no matter how justified my resistance, the truth was that my daughter had chosen greed over love, ambition over loyalty, and nothing could rewrite that choice. The house was still mine, but the family within it had vanished, and I walked through its rooms, feeling both like a victor and like the last inhabitant of a crumbling fortress. And yet, in the stillness of those days, I began to sense something else rising within me, not triumph, but a kind of peace I had not expected. For years I had lived under the shadow of fear, fear of being forgotten, fear of being pushed aside, fear of losing not just property, but the dignity that comes from being seen as a whole person. The ordeal had stripped away illusions, had forced me to confront the cruelty of those closest to me. But in surviving it, I discovered that I was stronger than they believed, that age had not hollowed me out completely, that my voice still mattered. When spoken with truth, I no longer needed to beg for Maggie's affection, no longer needed to measure myself against the coldness of her ambition. I was my own man still, and in that realization, there was a freedom that surprised me. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the attic, I came across an old wooden box that had been pushed behind other belongings. Inside it, wrapped in a cloth yellowed with time, were the shoes that had been hidden from me at the wedding. Whether someone had returned them secretly, or whether they had been tossed aside carelessly and later placed among my things, I will never know. But when I held them in my hands, the leather cracked beneath my fingers, and the memories flooded back. Eleanor walking toward me on our wedding day, Maggie laughing as a child, while I lifted her onto my shoulders, the long years of labor and love that had filled my life. They were worn, imperfect, no longer suited for ceremony, but they were mine, and they carried within them the weight of everything that had been trampled but not destroyed. I placed them by the fireplace as a reminder, not of humiliation, but of endurance, a symbol that, though others had tried to strip me bare, I had walked out, still owning myself. I know now that my story will not be one of reconciliation, that Maggie has chosen her path, and I must walk mine alone. But I also know that solitude is not the same as defeat. I tend my garden, I fix small engines for neighbors, I read the old books Eleanor loved, and in the quiet I find moments of contentment that no courtroom or betrayal can erase. Perhaps one day Maggie will realize what she has lost. Perhaps she will look back on the photographs from her wedding and notice the empty space where her father should have stood. But whether that day comes or not is no longer my concern. My life is my own again, not in the sense of possessions or titles, but in the deeper sense of dignity, of standing upright even when those dearest to me tried to bend me low. They hid my shoes before the wedding, thinking they could leave me barefoot and broken, but I walked out of that ordeal still standing, still walking, still owning not only the roof over my head, but the unshakable truth of who I am. And in the quiet of these evenings, as the sun sets over the small town that has always been my home, I feel Eleanor's presence beside me, and I know that in the ledger of life, whatever losses I have endured, I have kept the one possession that matters most, myself.